Mr. President, I rise today because the Senate has three choices on how it's going to protect coastal communities from the economic ravages of the oil spills that we are seeing in the Gulf. We can have fishermen, coastal residents, tourism-based small businesses endure the suffering of lost revenue caused by a man-made disaster that was no fault of their own, which clearly in my mind isn't fair. We can have taxpayers provide them with a safety net, which I oppose, or we can make polluters pay all of the damages they cause from a spill, which is, I think, the appropriate course. It's not a hard choice. You know, when I was a kid, my mother taught me all I think we need to know here. I'm sure everybody was taught the same way. You clean up your own mess, and you're responsible for it. And that's all we're asking BP or any other company to do. Clean up the mess, pay for whatever mess you can't clean up yourself, and the damages that flow from what you did. You know, the current law sets a $75 million cap on how much an oil company has to pay for damages. That means BP doesn't have to pay more than $75 million for lost business revenues from fishing or tourism damage to the environment, the coastline, or the lost tax revenues of state and local governments. So, Mr. President, I have introduced with a series of my colleagues raising that liability cap for offshore oil well spills from $75 million to $10 billion. Now, some of my colleagues have objected to this proposal because they're worried that it will drive oil drilling companies in the Gulf out of business. Well, you know, in the case of BP, that is a little hard to understand. It's a rather strange argument. After all, BP's profits amounted to $5.6 billion for the first 3 months of this year. Profits, not proceeds, profits. That breaks down to $94 million in profits each and every day. That means their current damages liability under the law of $75 million is less than 1 day's profits. Less than 1 day's profits. Now, not every company drilling in the Gulf is as big as BP, but why, I say to my colleagues who raise that issue, why should an oil company get such a low liability cap when any average person driving down the street has unlimited liability? Why should a company doing an inherently dangerous and potentially polluting activity like oil drilling enjoy such a low cap on liability when the guy installing a solar panel on your roof has unlimited liability? It simply doesn't make sense. The oil companies want it both ways. They want to keep the profits when everything works out well and times are good, but they want taxpayers to bail them out when they spill. It's fundamentally wrong. Our bill is as simple as it gets. It says no bailout for BP. It says BP pays for its own mess, not the nation's taxpayers. It says either you want to fully protect the small businesses and communities devastated by the spill, or you want to protect multi-billion-dollar oil companies from being held fully accountable. Now, BP says that they're going to be liable for all legitimate claims. Now, it won't define what legitimate is. So if they're saying that, why are we hesitant to raise the liability cap to make sure that what they're saying is kept true and that anyone else in the future will have the same responsibility? Does anyone who has been watching the images coming in from the Gulf believe that we should be protecting multi-billion-dollar oil companies instead of the small businesses, fisheries, coastal residents who are losing their livelihoods? It seems to me that it's time that this Senate stand up to big oil and make them pay for their own mess, not taxpayers, small business owners, states, or the federal government. So I know my series of colleagues who have co-sponsored this legislation with me want to speak. At the end of that process, I intend to make a unanimous consent request so that we can move forward and make sure now, not years later, now, that all those who are damaged as a result of the spill in the Gulf are protected, and that taxpayers don't pay 1 penny towards this liability that BP and others may have. And with that, Mr. President, for the moment, I yield the floor. Mr. President, to summarize, this is very simple. Whose side are you on? Are you on the side of the taxpayers or multi-billion-dollar oil companies? Are you on the side of fishermen working hard to make a living, or on the side of multi-billion-dollar oil companies? Are you side of the small inns that make the tourism for the Gulf region, or on the side of multi-billion-dollar oil companies? Are you on the side of coastal communities that are going to have to be affected by virtue of the spill, or on the side of multi-billion-dollar oil companies? So because of the fierce urgency of now, we believe that it is necessary to ask unanimous consent that the Environment and Public Works Committee be discharged from further consideration of S-3305, the Big Oil Bailout Prevention Liability Act of 2010, and that the Senate then proceed to its consideration, that the bill be read 3 times, passed, and the motion to reconsider be laid upon the table.
Mr. President.
Is there objection? Senator from Oklahoma.
First of all, I do reserve the right to object.
Look, I regret that my colleague, distinguished colleague from Oklahoma, has decided to object. I would simply say, if you're a quote-unquote independent, now, and some of these independent companies, some of them are valued at $40 billion. But even if they're not, does it mean that just because you're not the BPs of the world, that you should have less liability? That if this spill in the Gulf was done not by a BP or an ExxonMobil or any of those, but from some other entity, that there should be less liability for them? So therefore, they can take the risk and go ahead and drill, and if it works out, they get all the profits. But if they spill, their liability would be limited under the guise that we're going to create a monopoly for the Big Five. I'm for creating that liability across the entire range. Because if you're involved in a dangerous activity, one that can create enormous environmental and economic damage, then you should face the liability for such, whether you are BP or whether you are some intermediate entity. So I don't understand quite the nature of suggesting that, you know, we're going to try to give the big companies some, you know, form of monopoly. Actually, it seems to me that what we're doing is using that argument. I've heard this argument several times, to not create the liability that is necessary for everybody, so that regardless of who creates this set of circumstances and has a spill, and therefore fishermen, shrimp fishermen, seafood processing companies, tourism, coastal communities, and our environment are damaged, that they should be, you know, let off the hook because they're not as big as BP.